was sitting on the plane heading to Wellington, and I saw Wayne's head in a few seats ahead of me, and I thought, I bet I know where he's been, and so it was the case. Wayne, take it away.
Thank you, Stuart, very much. Thanks, good to be here tonight. It's a hard act to follow, Sydney Tools and pyrotechnic lithium batteries. I'll see how I go. I'm an enigma, I'm an oxymoron, and I'm a contradiction. So I drive one of the smallest cars that's parked outside this club room. It's a little A-class Mercedes, not a new car. I stick to the speed limit. A couple of months ago, when I bumped into Stuart on a plane, I'd just come back from Germany, our pilgrimage to the Nürburgring Nordschleife. I'm a racetrack that I've driven 285 kilometers on in a BMW. I might add, and we'll see maybe pictures of that a little bit later on. That's a conundrum. That's a contradiction. I call this story the endless race, and I've called it Continues because I've changed it from when I was last year. I've updated it, and also maybe talks a little bit more about the history. I call it the endless race because this year, Germany was my 29th year to drive in a 24-hour race on the Nürburgring, a race that at its heyday, and there are lesser cars in it now, at its heyday was attracting over 200 cars, 800 drivers for 24 hours. It's a week-long motorsport festival. There are all sorts of classes of car leading up to it, not the least of which are classics and huge oversubscribed fields, 250 plus fields. They race a 4-hour race. That's the preamble to the 24-hour that starts late Saturday afternoon, runs right through the night and finishes Sunday afternoon. The enormity of this event just defies belief, and it doesn't seem to matter how many times I go there. It has a wow factor every year. 235,000 fans camped around the racetrack this year. During the COVID years, I still went, and that was fascinating. No fans camped around the racetrack. There were 10,000 sitting side by side in pairs, no more than pairs in the grandstand, protecting each other in that COVID world. I'm really glad I went. Having said that, it was a fascinating environment to drive where there was no atmosphere other than in the pits, but maybe I'll pick that up a little bit later in the story too. Some people don't believe I'm a race car driver. They think we need to be aggressive. Not so. Absolutely not so. And some people ask me where the seeds were sown. And it casts my mind back, and I'm not really sure. Talk to go-kart drivers maybe coming to the day Manfield in a few weeks' time. I couldn't afford a go-kart when I was a kid. My family couldn't. There were too many flagons of beer coming into our home for me to ever be able to own a go-kart as a kid. Once a month from Island Bay, we went to the Happy Valley tip of Fera Bay. And there was a go-kart track at the bottom of that hill on Happy Valley Road. Dad would drop me off there while he took the rubbish up to the dump and then probably pick me up 5 minutes later, kicking and screaming back in the car to head back home. Maybe that's where the seeds are sown. Or I think more likely on the backside of Volga Street in Island Bay, very narrow, windy road which runs right up the hill, was the Houghton Bay, the road to Houghton Bay. And once a year was the Gold Star Hill Climb, and sometimes the New Zealand Championship. And us kids, when we heard the sound of cackling car exhaust, emptied our village. It was like the Pied Piper calling kids. And we'd wait at the top of the hill and then beg the owner of the Bread Van Anglia, the Mini, the Jaguar, the Zephyr, to sit on the floor, burn our little bums, because you know how hot race car floors can get, as they ticky-toed back down, and we'd run up the paths of the golf course again, wait for the drive. Sometimes even I remember hanging onto a leg because I was going in the Zephyr. Nobody else was going to sit in that car. Maybe that's where the seeds were sown, such that when I got my license when I was 18, I didn't, and when I was 16, it was my friends that had the accidents. It was my knees that crashed into the glove box in the passenger seat. I didn't want to get my license till I could afford to buy a reasonably decent car. That was a Mark II Herman Hunter. It was reasonably decent in that day. And then I rang Wellington Car Club because I knew to compete in this sport. And there was something inside me that told me I had to compete. I was ringing Wellington Car Club, which was the club room's nowhere near as stunning this one, and it's been demolished now. Had a black Bakelite phone on the wall. No answer phones, of course, in that era. The club rooms was used 2 nights a month, so no one was answering the phone. And in the end of frustration, I left a note on the door and I was invited along to a club night. rooms were much smaller than this, and the racing guys were there, and they were all guys. The motor car, Jim Carn, they called it then, guys were there, the rally guys were there, the trials runs were here, and no one wanted to know a young guy who'd come to the door of the club rooms, and they just sort of filled the space. But I had to join, and I started competing Lower North Island. I was talking to someone before, the RX-7 that I own being restored in Cambridge at the moment, a Mark II left-hand drive coming from America. We're putting a triple rotor into it. When it had a 13B and it was red, still holds some records in the Lower North Island. Before that, I had a green, Kermit Green, Slime Green RX3, again, still holds some records in the Lower North Island. Cut my teeth on those events. And then a dear friend died really suddenly, and I got off my arse and took off my bucket list something that I had wanted to do, and that was driving in a national series. And I bought a Nissan Sentra turnkey race car and drove in the Nissan races, the time of the Nissan Mobile Street Race. So around the Wellington streets, Pukekohe, Manfield, the series expanded to. And about that time too, a young friend from Germany arrived in New Zealand. Sorry, he wasn't a young friend at that point. He was a faceless person at the doorway of the Wellington Car Club club, who obviously didn't know anybody, and I befriended Florian Schmidt and welcomed him into our club rooms and joined him at the table. Florian had bought a Toyota Starlet rally car because he couldn't afford to rally in Europe, and he didn't know anybody other than the two Germans he worked with who had absolutely no interest in motorsport. I co-drove with Florian for 18 months or so. Then he went back to Germany, and the future rally for him as he started rallying in Europe was the Isle of Man. But he was worried about his skills on tarmac, despite driving on autobahns all the time. And he'd heard of this race at a place called the Nürburgring, which then was in its 20-something year. It was a 24-hour race. He'd been given a Suzuki Swift, or loaned a Suzuki Swift from a Suzuki franchise. They were prepared to race prep it for him, put a cage in it, and Florian decided to enter the Nürburgring 24-hour race. No internet. He wrote me a letter. Would I like to come and drive? Holy hell, I left a whole lot. I had to head off to the library, look up Nürburgring, Nordschleife, identify this place that was built from 1925 through to 1927 when it opened. So it almost has its 100-year centenary. It was built with sheer blood and guts, as you can see in that picture there, very little mechanization. And the Nordschleife part of Nürburgring is 20.4 kilometers long. And it's mountainous, not hugely mountainous. I think 400 meters is the elevation from top point to low point. And Florian wrote me a letter. Would I like to come and join him in the Suzuki Swift driving on this racetrack? I'd never been to Europe. If you'd asked me then, would you ever go? I probably didn't have much intention. I'd lived in Southwest Pacific for 5 years, Australia for a few years. But I headed off into the unknown. Was met at the airport by Florian. He advertised in German motorsport media, Auto Bild, and he attracted two brothers who worked for Volkswagen, Eberhard and Norbert, and they joined as the third and fourth drivers. No English, and I had no Deutsch. Florian was the interpreter who brought the team together. My early laps around the Nürburgring Nordschleife, no Gran Turismo, no PlayStation, no learning it online, were frightening, absolutely frightening. Even at the end of year one, driving this little black Suzuki, I was still frightened. I could not put all the pieces of the circuit together. Eberhard and Norbert, the brothers from Volkswagen, were hooked. Florian vowed and declared he would never ever drive the racetrack again, and he hasn't. He's come as a passenger sometimes in the car, and he often joined the team as interpreter. So he was on the radio while I was in the race car, and that's been incredibly helpful. And we still have a very strong relationship. I meet him every year, and as I say, this is my 29th year. So Florian wrote me the letter again that Eberhard and Norbert would like to drive, and I went and joined them in their stunningly immaculate Golf 2. That led to 17 years with Volkswagen, and depending upon financial situations, more and more factory help. So sometimes we drove factory turnkey race cars. We drove Bora, Jetta, for a couple of years, 1.9 litre diesel. We drove Golf 4s for some years that were factory-owned cars. And it was really humbling because I usually didn't have to dig my hand too deeply into my pocket to get to this incredible race. And so over time, my confidence built with the circuit, the camaraderie with the Germans, who initially were very, very aloof, didn't really want to know somebody from the other side of the world. And I guess you prove your pedigree in the driving seat of the car. English was not a spoken language, and the race itself was quite unfriendly. This year, there were 30 nationalities and 24 marks across around 600 drivers. So it now has become incredibly international. We drove one year, in the picture there, the Seat Super Copa. A couple of those subsequently came to New Zealand, competed in events here. That was a dream little car for me, like a little go-kart, although I didn't have a grounding in go-kart. Just two pedals and like a bloody cat, just incredible car. Transitioned out of Volkswagen after that journey of 17 years, a range of circumstances, and those quasi-factory drives stopped, and I had to fund myself. Stuart talked about working to do the things you enjoy working at the weekend, and I still do. I work full-time, goddammit. Maybe it's just an addiction to the Nürburgring. After the Volkswagen days, I had to put my flag up the pole a wee bit, and I joined a Danish team. And we drove BMWs, and the one that I've established my personal best speed in, and not my fastest lap time in, was at 335 E92, and it's 285 kilometres an hour. That car, when COVID arrived, didn't come from Denmark because the owner of it, a Danish lawyer who also was a driver, couldn't find a third and a fourth driver. Quite a challenge in that world. And since then, I've joined another team, but a little bit more on that in due course. I stay in a village entirely within the confines of the racetrack. So the white line there is the Nordschleife. The red line at the bottom left-hand corner is the Formula One Grand Prix course. The yellow circle is Hirschbusch Village, and that's racetrack. And you can't see the racetrack. It's very hard for people who only maybe know Manfield or Pukekohe or Hampton Downs or even the Old Bay Park. You know, you look everywhere from within the race. You can't have a village within a racetrack. The enormity of this place just defies belief. There's a pension. The pension I stay in, which has been very humbling because it now no longer is a guest house due to the aging occupants. But Vane, it is your home. It is your home for as long as you're coming to Germany. So I'm very humbled to have those sort of acquaintance. This racetrack is a business. It's a huge business. It's actually owned now by a billionaire Russian, which if you put that story too far up the flagpole could create all sorts of angst. He's also just bought the nearest airport in Germany to the racetrack. It's probably another story. The racetrack's used by manufacturers, predominantly car, tyre companies, motorcycle companies, for testing product during the day, not in winter. Ice and snow can prevail. And it's so publicly accessible that cars need to be camouflaged. There's a lot of icons, there's a lot of stories. Opened in 1927. A recent person who was particularly special, who died too early in life, was Sabina Smits, labelled as the fastest taxi driver in the world. She used to take people for tourist laps and BMW ring taxis. And Sabina passed away tragically from breast cancer, and there's a wonderful memorial to her. In fact, turn one of the Nordschleife is labelled Sabina Smits curve. When the manufacturers stop using the racetrack, 5 o'clock in the evening, and all go home until the customer wants area times, it opens to the public, and they're called tourist fahrten or tourist laps. When I first went there, I think from memory it was about 12 Deutschmarks, which was probably about 12 New Zealand dollars. Now it's just over 30 euro, which is about 60 New Zealand dollars for one lap of the Nordschleife. But it's just so addictive. People come from all over Europe in their hundreds and thousands. Once upon a time, I used to reacquaint the racetrack each year, driving whatever I'd rented from Hertz or Avis. You don't do that now. and you rent a little race car or whatever you want, or you borrow a car, or you get out there somehow. And I've been renting, coincidentally, a Suzuki Swift. It's all gone well for me. It's a very, very dangerous time. Top Gear visited the old Top Gear. Jeremy Clarkson talked of one death a week on this racetrack. How the hell that even was tolerated, I don't know. And there has to be something with local government, because that private enterprise wouldn't be able to sustain that. They'd be sued all the way to wherever. Even just this last weekend, I see online there was a 7-car incident with oil on the racetrack, and 7 cars sort of careered off into the barrier. And one of them was an AMG taxi. So a professional driver. You know, you're a passenger when there's oil. When the race car stops when the racetrack stops and closes as a consequence of a major incident, the enormity of the number of cars on it just defies belief. So this is a picture of a queue of cars waiting essentially to get off the racetrack. But it's so congested, they've just parked up. Once a year, the place changes, and that's when it becomes magical for me. The 24-hour race of the Nürburgring, which in the early days was a touring car race. Now there's a real predominance of GT3 cars at the front of the field, factory teams fighting ferociously with each other to win the race. And as a consequence, attracting an incredible spectacle. So people come from all around Europe, fans camp in the streets before they get access to the racetrack the Sunday before the race. So they come in on the Sunday, the week before the race, and they build these incredible, just places to be. And some of them are sort of fully built within trucks. There are lifts within trucks to take people up to the roof. They have paddling pools for kids to play in. They build grandstands. They have trailer loads of firewood and another trailer load of beer. But it's not the aggression that there is, say, at Bathurst, where they had to put a fence at the top of the mountain to keep Ford and Holden apart, give them their separate facilities. There's a real camaraderie here. So just as the fans are getting ready, so are the track preparations. I try and get there a week before, because part of this ambience and the creativity is all just fuels the excitement for me. So there's a whole lot of stuff that happens, and it's sort of travel around the place and talk with fans and meet with them again year on year. I don't know how I'm going to stop this addiction. And addiction, I think, is the right word. Wind the clock. I live here now, or I've Kapiti Coast, Paikakariki, but before that we lived in Tauranga. We got caught with a leaky home, which took the value of the property from that to that. And when we arrived down here, decided that I couldn't go. I did miss 1 year. And I didn't realise how much I was eating away inside me. It was my dear partner who said, you've got to try and go again. And I have been every year again since then, such that I write on a marshal's hut, so I've engraved on the wall there, maybe a little bit hard to see, Waynmore, New Zealand, in the years that I've been at the Nürburgring. And when I first put up there, 1994 to 2015, my dear friend Florian, the same one I rally co-drove with, said, "Oh, that driver died young." This whole racetrack is under the auspices of a 12th century ruin. Roman ruin. You can pay €3 or €4, climb to the top of this castle and get an incredible panoramic view of the racetrack and just some really stunning surrounding scenery. When I first went to Germany, I had the perception that the whole place was dead. People had told me the Black Forest was dying and blah, 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 and there didn't read much different in library books to dispel those theories. It's absolutely not the case. This is a stunningly beautiful part of Germany. It's an hour and a half from Frankfurt, 3/4 an hour from Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium, so really close to Belgium. Easy to do both racetracks if you intend to make a pilgrimage there. Very close to the Dutch border, and very close to the Mosel River, where there's some stunning villages. The closest is Cochem, which you have to say with phlegm in your throat. So just as the fans are building their infrastructure and people are preparing the racetrack, so the teams are coming in. And when the Danish team decided that they couldn't come to the racetrack, so the COVID area when the whole world had gone dead and quiet, I put my shingle up the pole. My driving pedigree, my CV, as it were, New Zealander without much money, a lot of experience, would love to come and drive. And I joined a team sponsored by GT Tyres, who initially I was saying GT Tyres, it's not GT, it's GT Tyres. They're a Singaporean-based tyre company I had never heard of. They have 40,000 employees around the world. They're growing, particularly a truck tyre market in New Zealand. They have a premise here in Auckland. And I've since been with this team now for 5 years. And I think with hindsight, it's the best team I've ever been in for a couple of reasons. I know technically they're very, very good. Their cars are absolutely immaculate, beautifully presented, incredibly reliable, total German, we've bagged BMWs before, total German precision. And after we made the agreement that, yep, they'd like me to drive and I'd be happy to come and drive with them, the next email said, what are your food preferences? I have never, ever been asked that by a race team before. We ask it at work. People come on training courses and so on. What are your dietary requirements? You get it on the aeroplane if you don't eat nuts or whatever. I've never been asked it by a race team. Holy hell. They got the technical bit right. They got the people bit right too. And that's exactly the way it's worked. I knew nobody in that team when I joined them as a mature age man, and a lot of them young enough to bring my grandchildren. But the camaraderie has just been incredible. They're just delightful. I'm going back next year and I just can't wait to meet with them again. This whole thing's a big reunion for me. The enormity of it, 235,000 fans. That's not counting fans the way we do, adding Thursday to Friday to Saturday to Sunday. That's in one place at the one time. It's unbelievable, just defies and beggars belief. And they're all there for carnival, and some of them hell-bent on the motor racing. Some of them probably don't see any motor racing. They're so busy dressing up like fans at the Sevens years and years ago in Wellington. It's just the enormity. You know, there's one camp area, Brunshin, where I don't know how many thousand people are near the racetrack, but then there's a major highway and there's another campground on the other side. They call it Pensioner Meadow. They probably never ever come across the road to get to the racetrack, but many of them have setups. They're watching on their big screens, so I guess, you know, at least they can smell it and at least they can hear it a wee bit. Maybe there's a wee bit more ambience than when they're at home. We finished that first race. We finished most races. I've been there 29 years now and have finished 25 races. Some years it's not going to happen. Some years it's been a mechanical failure. Some years it's been a crash. Moderate crashes can be repaired. I've been really pissed off the last 2 years. This year was fine. 2022 and 2021, hit by a passing GT3, which is really pissing off. And there's a lot of aggression at the front of the field. You know, when I was first going, it was the that speed Viper. It was one of two BMWs, maybe a Mercedes that could have won the race. Now it's any one of 60 cars. Professional drivers, sometimes young Kiwis there. Richie Stanaway's been there, El Bamba regularly. El Bamba won the race this year in a Ferrari. Did we see anything in the media in New Zealand? Not a skirt, unless you've been hunting for the frickadelli Ferrari. And I don't know how he made that transition because he's been driving for Manthey Porsche. I don't know how that happened, and maybe that's another story. So we're a small team, albeit it's a marketing business. This year we ran 4 cars, and we had a 5th car that was looked after by the team, albeit run by a breaker racing from England. That was an interesting story. There are 2 Grants there from New Zealand, neither of whom I've met. Grant Dalton and Grant Wolford. Dalton is the yachting guy. They've attained their A licenses to drive in the Nürburgring. And there's quite a protocol to go through now, improving safety on this racetrack. There was a time, well, in fact, when I went there, you just entered the race and you just drove. Now you have to do two 4-hour races and be observed, and they're held a month apart. So for these guys, that was separate trips. You also do a 2-day driving academy. For these guys, that was another trip. They reckon they spent $100,000 each to attain their license. So there's not a lot of Kiwis and Aussies in the field now. This year there were 5 Kiwis, Alabama, a guy, Tony Richards from Christchurch, has been driving a wee bit, myself, of course, and the 2 Grants doing their first event. The largest village is Ardenau, has a population of almost 3,000, has 6 supermarkets.
And the best pizza in Nürburgring.
6 supermarkets at Pinocchio. 6 supermarkets because of the influx of this crowd. That village, and it's a historic village, they close their main street on Wednesday afternoon. Everything stops. The buses do tour around the back, picking the kids up from school, and they build a stage, and there's beer bloody passed around, and the race teams parade through the village. It's just extraordinary, the camaraderie of the atmosphere, and even the folks camping on the hills. You know, our family might support Aston Martin, and yours might support Nissan. There's no rivalry. Kids are playing together, we're sharing food, we're sharing beers. And I think part of it is the core love for the racetrack. The organisers of the event this year with that record crowd were really congratulatory on how clean the campers left the race site. There are other major events here. This is not the one-off each year. There are truck Grand Prix, there are huge festivals. There might be 500 Ferraris one weekend from all around Europe, or 2,000 Porsches, classic meetings. There's all sorts of events and activities. The Carwins leave it clean. Rockham Ring, absolute pigsty. That's the multiplicity of stages, rock bands, campers. No attraction or no feeling for the racetrack. This year, fans were in enormity, and we spent a lot of time. I don't know how many posters we signed, how many hero cards they called them we signed and gave away, how many shirts we signed, how many arms or caps or old slick tyres we signed. It's a really special part of the event. The pits are open, which is quite significant, I think, because it creates that real rapport between those that have the privilege to drive, those that work with the teams, those that work around the racetrack, and those that come to watch and experience it. This team's quite unique. They have one car that's girls only, built by women, driven by women, solely crewed by women. This year, drivers from 4 different countries, and sometimes they have a list of female drivers knocking on the door to join the team and drive. And it's a significant part of their marketing endeavour. The infrastructure at Nürburgring is enormous. This is the media centre. Driver briefings are held in the media centre. There's a briefing now in English, more accepted language. There's a briefing in Deutsch. It's compulsory that you attend the briefing. Also compulsory now too, as part of the safety implication, that you complete an online e-learning course. And despite it not changing much year on year, I still find it a stressful experience, sitting at home for 3 hours at the computer where you only get a limited number of opportunities to get the thing right. And sometimes the Deutsch English translation is a little bit questionable, well, that's my excuse anyway. Enormous number of people required to support the event, just the logistics of it. Marshals camp around the racetrack for that entire week. They are volunteers, and we're really appreciative of them. When there's nothing happening on the track at night, crowds come out onto it, and they paint their slogans on it. If they've used house paint and it's slippery, the organisers will take it off. But often they're using paint that obviously has a reasonable sort of grip, because it's part of the place. It's part of the DNA of the place. Many of you have driven Nordschleife and Nürburgring on Gran Turismo or PlayStation. The graphics are even included. I'm no bloody good on that sort of technology. I didn't learn my racing creed on it. I sit on someone's bloody sim racer now, and I'm absolutely useless at it. It lacks the feel for me. This is still a very bumpy racetrack. There are places where the car is off the ground. There are places where you can't see over the brow. One corner might look very much like another. There is still an inordinate number of crashes in the race. This year, the field, I think, was 148 cars. Don't quote me, maybe a little bit less than that. I've talked about a peak sometimes of 200 in past years. A lot of the smaller cars aren't there now, I think, because of the aggression at the front of the field. Pretty exciting when I get there, Tuesday of race week. Haven't seen the team for a year. They're sitting up in the pits. Pop your head into the garage, see your race car, your name on the window. The first time this year was a 330. It was a new car. We drove a 328. They're both 2-litre turbo BMWs. Drove a 328i last year that was subsequently destroyed in a crash. The start of the race is just impalpable. Like you grid for 2 hours. It can be bloody freezing cold, or it can be incredibly hot, or it can be somewhere in between. The race start this year is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I was fourth driver, due to start at 11 o'clock at night. It's a long time since you woke up at 7 o'clock. We had breakfast 7 o'clock in the morning. So I was going to hibernation on race day. I don't want to use energy. I watched the start this year and then went and had a sleep. If I owned the team or owned the car, I'm not sure if I could sleep. But just being a driver, I feel quite comfortable sleeping at the racetrack, despite 110 decibels is the noise limit there, much lower here, despite the noise and the ambience of the racetrack passing you by. Start there, 3 groups of 60, 70, whatever number of cars, and it's a slow procession behind a safety car. And the crowds come out onto the racetrack. They're now behind a tape, but once upon a time they were right out there, and you were able to drive a left-hand drive car, put your head out the window, your tears streaming down your face. It's an incredibly emotional experience. Pull yourself together, mate. You're starting a bloody motor race in 10 minutes' time. It's just incredibly moving. Not uncommon for cars on turn 1 at the start of the race to end up on the gravel track. There's an incredible amount of aggression to be featured on the television camera. First up, best dressed. But why? There's 24 hours still to go. I just do not understand or get the aggression. For the factory teams now, 24 hours is a sprint race. Absolute sprint race. It's at a record distance this year. We had perfect weather. Some years that's not the case. Some years there's fog on the racetrack. Some years there has been we can race when it rains. But some years there's been so much rain, there have been rivers running across the racetrack, and they've had to stop the race for a period of time until the water drained. I think each time they do improvement works on the Nordschleife, which is essentially still the same road that it always has been when Nicky Lauda had his fiery crash and Formula One subsequently stopped using it. Each time they do improvement works, they improve drainage. So it does get better. And you learn over time where the water runs across it. Year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, I didn't have a bloody clue where the water was running across this racetrack at night time. There's one part on it, 3 kilometres straight, called Dotting the Hur, which then kinks under a bridge. When it's wet, the car shifts sideways, and you've got to hope that the 2 cars that are beside you shift sideways the same way. It's hard in the mouth sometimes. Down the Fuchsrock, 240, 250, 260 kilometres an hour, and then you're flying up the other side, almost as though you're coming out of something that's been fired from a bloody gun. And then there's night time. The ambience with the crowd is incredible. It was really weird at night in COVID when there were nobody camping around the racetrack, which was a weird German thing because spectators had been allowed to watch tourist laps the weekend before, but during the 24-hour race, they were banned from camping. It was really weird. Last 2 years, the crowd have been back, and they're back with a vengeance. At night, they have explosive devices that might be some relic of a bloody war. They're so frigging loud. You can smell the steaks cooking as you race past them. There's all sorts of flares and fireworks and boom things going off, and you have to keep your smarts because they might have green lights or red lights, and those lights are also on the emergency vehicles. There are no pace cars here, like on our smaller circuits that bunch the field up. They isolate incidents and they have a localization called Code 60, which is a purple sign, and there's a maximum 60 kilometres as you pass that area. And maybe the people are working on the racetrack. We have GPS now, the very stringent control of 60 kilometres now because of that safety aspect. And cars that breach it suffer consequences. Have a dear mate, Morris O'Reilly. Some of you may know Morris, but an icon of New Zealand motorsport, lived in Mount Maunganui, drove in the Nürburgring for many years, and then threw his toys out of the cop when they took away his license from him because he breached the code 60. He went through it at 143 kilometres an hour, and they had that from GPS. Morris didn't see a car off the side of the track, didn't see the 60 sign, didn't see the green sign, whatever, but that was no excuse. But it's fair enough. People working on the track, we have to protect their safety. After a drive, and no driver can drive for more than 3 hours without a 2-hour break. I go and have sleep, have a shower, have something to eat. But the crew don't. The crew work through. So there are crews sleeping everywhere, lying on tyre warmers, or just sleeping in the box, sleeping in the garage, and we're incredibly reliant on them. Running the 5 cars this year, some people do the same job for each car. So, for example, the person who cleans the windscreen, I think one had tear-offs. The others were clean. Refueling people, fire extinguisher people are the same people. And each car will have its core crew of 3 people. And then others come when help is required. You have to get to the finish. Absolutely critical to get to the finish. And now there's a ruling that says you must do 50% of the winning car's distance. Last year, after the crash that I had, we had 5 hours repair. It was quite significant. 5 hours repair, and we fought like hell to get to the finish of that motor race, and we're still aggressively driving right at the end of it, and we got there by 1 lap, which was incredibly satisfying. This year, the car went into limp mode for 1 lap, I think, when the gearbox indicated overheating. I was sleeping, I don't know much of the detail, but we got to the finish unscathed, essentially, and that is pretty special. Walk tall. Sometimes they play that Queen song, "We Are the Champions." Christ, I don't know how tall I get when you're bloody carrying your helmet back from the pits or down to the pits if you've been the last driver. I talked to crying at the start of the race. You'll cry on the last lap as well. You can't bloody help it. All of those fans, all of that energy, all of the excitement, all of the recognition of the crew. You know, there's 3 names on the window of the car. There's a hell of a lot of people who ensure that you get there. And there's a whole lot of people ride in the car. A lot of folks watch us online in New Zealand, friends and colleagues, and I'm really humbled and really appreciated by them. This was our total crew this year. This was a photo that we had at the start. I'm being a bit taller. I stood at the back until someone yelled out, "Drive us to the front." I thought, I don't know if I kneel down or I squat down, I might not be able to stand back up again. I'll lie down. And if you lie down, people will help you back up, and that's exactly what happened. After the race is interesting because you come from this incredible high and it all goes quiet. It's empty. The paddocks are empty. The rubbish is piled up. And everyone's gone away for another 12 months. And then I start opening the door again and look at the light that's approaching. This bloody event, 29 years, it's an addiction. I think it keeps me alive. I got T-shirts given to me by fans one year, which was really humbling. And they talked about the N in my DNA standing for Nürburgring. I'm pretty humbled by that. Next year's my 30th. It's getting bigger again. The talk of the 24-hour Nürburgring going intercontinental, it's linking with the 12-hour in Bathurst and 2 other events, Spa-Francorchamps and Indianapolis, as part of our GT3, GT4 series. So the future is just as exciting as it's always been in the past. New sponsor too. Company called Ravenel, German oil company, has just been announced. That's my story. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to start.
Can I come with you next year?
Well, interesting, because in my 10th year, my 20th year, and my 30th year, I'm taking a little tour group. And I put a flyer together. And I booked at the pension I stay at, which is available. I booked 10 rooms and I've given out 24 flyers. But someone eventually, I'm sure. There's an opportunity to come around the racetrack. I can take people, passenger laps in the rental race car. You want to give me an email if you want to fly. Seriously. I love sharing it. Many other years I've supported people to be there. Introduced them to the race. My dear mum came when she was 8 years of age, early stages of dementia. It was pretty special. She's passed now. Needed to put on her tag our box number and the little map to where our tent was in case she got herself lost in the enormity of that pit. Brings some pretty special time. I've been there after I lost my job one year. I've been there another time after I handed my job in because they wouldn't give me the leave. I've been there 2 weeks after my dad died. The place is really important. It's really special. Any other questions?
What is the licensing requirement?
So you need an A permit, which they call a gold card. So we crack all sorts of jokes about Winston Peters. And you attain it each year once you've had it, so long as it hasn't lapsed for 2 years, by resitting the e-learning test. But to attain it, you need to do 2 of the 4 or 6 hour VLN races. Those are, yes, 4 weeks apart, where the grants went to separate weekends, and you do a 2-day driving academy and you pass a test there as well. There was a lack of driving standard in the race at a time, and as a consequence they tightened up the rules, and they also banned smaller cars. So there was a team from Auckland, Kiwi team Nürburgring, KTN. They've just written a book. It's almost published. 21 drivers have written a chapter for a book. They went to the Nürburgring. They shipped Honda Civics from New Zealand for 6 years, and they did bloody well. They won their class. Some years first and second in their class. That made me feel incredibly proud to be a Kiwi. Okay, David. Yeah. It was headed by Greg Taylor, who's an Auckland breast surgeon who's just retired. He came this year with his new partner. So, and we had the privilege of meeting up and hosting it.
Is it an Inch-B license or an Inch-C license?
Mine is a C. Yeah. And there's 2 classes of license, an A or a B for the event, depending upon your capacity. So that big BMW, the 3-litre twin turbo, I needed the A license, so I've retained that. And that's for safety. There have also been other safety things too. Any of you who were here when I last did the presentation, an old slide that had actually a speed limit in it. 180 and another one was 200 kilometres an hour. One year, Nissan were there testing before the event in a 4-hour race, and a Skyline became airborne, flew over the 3-metre high fence, 3-metre high FIF, landed in the crowd. Injured 30 and only killed 1. That's tragic and also an incredible miracle. And the Germans brought down the rule book, and they took that bump out and they moved that bump and they banned bloody Nissans and they banned this and they banned that. They put up speed limits and then they got back to normal and started racing again. You can't race the speed limits.
Have you ever resorted to using the ring taxi?
I've never used ring taxi, no. I've always self-driven. And I say, I've never been pinged by an Avis or a Hertz or a Europe car, but some guys have, and I don't know whether they pay fines, but sometimes I've really worn the edge of the tyres off. And then try to park, sort of come bought your race car back, your rental car back to Frankfurt Airport and park, and the fluoros are brighter than these ones, and the guys are walking around and don't look at the tyres. But you can't do that now. There are paparazzi photographers that get a commission, I think, send photos.
So, you said the first sort of 4 or 5 years were really difficult.
Yeah.
So despite that, you still wanted to go back?
Yeah, absolutely. I had unfinished business. I wanted initially, even after the first year, as frightening as it was, I was mixed emotions. I was scared, but I also wanted to put a lap together. Fascinating now, you know, as high adrenaline and high speed as that is, if I can't get to sleep at night, I start driving a lap. I can't finish a Grand Prix course before I fall asleep.
Also, then the first time you see the Grand Prix courses, effectively started.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. You can do driver training on the Grand Prix course now. So it's just a big commercial enterprise. You can do driver training there, and I only see the last 2 weeks too that they've opened up another entry point for during tourist time. So the tourist laps on the North Loop, which is turn T13, to take some pressure off that grid that I showed you. Stop and stuff. Yes. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, guys, very much. Good being here. Thank you.
All right, no, look,